My name is Walter Meade, and for 11 years, every second Wednesday of the month, I did the same thing without ever once questioning it. I got up before the sun, made my coffee the same way I always had, black with just a little too much sugar. I drove the same route to the hardware store where I still worked 3 days a week, even though I didn't need the money for anything but this. I liked the work. Keeping my hands busy kept my mind from wandering someplace I didn't want it to go. But on those Wednesdays, after my shift ended at 2, I didn't head home like usual. I drove straight to the bank on 5th Street, the one with the brick front and the flag out front that never seemed to fly quite right, and I walked in like a man with an appointment he couldn't miss. The tellers there knew me. Not by name, not really, but by habit. I was the older fellow who came in every other Wednesday, filled out the same withdrawal slip in the same careful handwriting, and sent the same amount to the same account without ever saying much more than good afternoon. Nobody asked questions. After a while, nobody even looked twice. I think in a strange way I'd become part of the furniture of that place, like the potted plant by the door or the calendar nobody ever remembered to flip. And I told myself that was fine. I told myself a man my age didn't need people asking him questions about where his money went. I had my reasons. I'd had them for 11 years. The reasons went back to my son. Daniel was 31 when he died at a rail crossing not far from where I used to work signals for the line. I won't pretend I've made peace with saying that sentence out loud, even now, even after everything that came later. For a long time, saying his name still felt like touching something hot. He left behind a wife, Renee, and 2 kids who were small then and who I don't get to see much anymore, which is its own kind of ache I'll get to eventually. What matters right now, at the start of this, is that after Daniel died, Renee came to me one afternoon about 6 weeks after the funeral and told me there were obligations. That was her word. Obligations. Things tied to that night that the family needed help with. She didn't explain what they were, and God help me, I didn't ask. I just started paying. I told myself I owed it. I told myself it was the least I could do. That Wednesday, the one I'm telling you about now, started out no different from any of the others. I filled out my slip, same amount, same account number I'd memorized. So long ago I could write it in my sleep, and I got in line behind a woman with a stroller and an older man arguing quietly with someone on his phone. When I got to the window, there was somebody new sitting there. A young man, maybe 25, with a name tag that said Marcus, and the kind of careful posture people have when they're still learning the job and don't want to mess anything up. I didn't think much of it. Tellers came and went. I slid my slip across the counter the way I always did and waited for him to process it the way they always did, quick and quiet, like it was nothing. But Marcus didn't move right away. He looked down at the slip, then up at me, then back down at it again, like he was doing some kind of math in his head that didn't add up right. I remember feeling my stomach tighten a little, the way it does when something in your routine shifts even slightly, and your body notices before your mind catches up. He asked me to confirm the account number, which was normal enough, and I did. Then he asked how long I'd been sending money to that account. And I told him, 11 years, without really thinking about how strange that must have sounded coming out of my mouth in a bank lobby on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. He didn't say anything smart or judgmental. He wasn't trying to be difficult. If anything, his voice got a little softer, like he could see something in my face I didn't know I was showing. And then he asked me the question, "Sir, who told you that you owed this?" I opened my mouth to answer him, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I realized, standing right there at that counter with people in line behind me, that I'd never once asked myself that question in 11 years. I knew who had told me. Renee had told me. But when Marcus asked it plain like that, out loud in the daylight, like grief, it didn't sound like a fact anymore. It sounded like something I'd just accepted, the way you accept the weather, without ever once demanding proof. I finished the transaction because I didn't know what else to do. I said something about it being a family matter, and he nodded, like that made sense, even though I could tell by his face that it hadn't really. I walked back out to my truck in the parking lot, and I sat there for longer than I meant to, keys in my hand, engine off, just turning that question over and over. Who told me I owed this? I'd never asked for a document. I'd never asked for a number or reason, a name of a lawyer or an account holder, or anything that would have made it real in the way that debts are supposed to be real. I had just believed her, because believing her felt like doing right by Daniel, and doing right by Daniel was the only thing I had left that felt like it mattered. But sitting there in that parking lot for the first time in 11 years, I let myself wonder if I'd been doing right by him at all, or if I'd just been carrying a weight somebody else had handed me and never once asked me to check the scale. I drove home that day without turning on the radio, which for me is saying something because I like a little noise in the truck, some old country station humming under the engine sound. But that afternoon, I just wanted quiet because my mind had already gone someplace it hadn't been in a long while, and I needed the room to let it happen. I keep going back to the night Daniel died, even though I've spent 11 years trying not to. He was 31, married to Renee, with a little girl, Emma, who was barely 3 at the time, and a boy, Cole, who wasn't even born yet. Renee was carrying him. Daniel worked nights at a distribution center about 20 minutes from where I used to man the signal box on the rail line just outside town. I'd been a signalman for almost 30 years by then, the kind of job most people don't think about until something goes wrong, because when it's working right, nobody notices you at all. That night, I was on shift. I remember it clear as anything, the hum of the equipment, the low light of the control room, the sound of a train coming through on schedule like it always did. Daniel's route home crossed those same tracks. He'd driven that crossing 1,000 times. Same as everybody in town who worked night. I don't know exactly what happened in the seconds before it, and for years, I told myself I didn't want to know, because knowing felt like it would only make things worse. What I do know is that the gate came down late, or maybe it malfunctioned, or maybe there was some kind of failure nobody could explain right away. I know that because that's what people said in the confusion right after, in the kind of half-formed sentences people use when they're trying to be gentle with a grieving father. Somewhere in my head, in the guilt that took root that night and never really left, I turned there was a failure into I failed. I was the one on duty. I was the one who signed the shift log. Even though I wasn't anywhere near that crossing when it happened, even though there was nothing in my hands that night that could have stopped it, I made myself responsible anyway, because grief doesn't care much about logic, and mine needed somewhere to go. The funeral was the kind of gray, quiet day you'd expect. I remember holding Renee's hand at the graveside, her belly just barely starting to show with Cole, and I remember thinking that whatever she needed from me for the rest of my life, she was going to have it, no questions asked. That's not a complicated feeling. Any father would understand it. My son was gone, and the woman standing next to his casket was carrying his last child, and there wasn't a single thing in this world I wouldn't have handed over to make her pain smaller. Even a little 6 weeks after the funeral, Renee came to my house on a Sunday afternoon. I remember the kids were with her, Emma asleep in her car seat, and Renee sat across from me at my kitchen table looking thinner than I'd ever seen her, like grief had hollowed something out of her that hadn't grown back yet. She said there were things she needed to talk to me about, financial things, obligations tied to that night, things the family was going to need help managing. She didn't go into detail. I remember she looked down at her hands a lot while she talked. I remember thinking that was just grief too, that a woman who just buried her husband shouldn't have to explain herself to her father-in-law like she was asking for charity. So I told her whatever it was, I'd take care of it. I didn't ask what it meant. I didn't ask for a number or a name or a piece of paper. I think some part of me was almost relieved to have something to do with the guilt I was carrying, some way to make it useful, instead of just letting it sit in my chest like a stone. If I could pay for what happened in whatever form that took, then maybe I wasn't just a man who'd let his son die on his watch. Maybe I was a man who was making it right. That's how it started. A vague conversation at a kitchen table, a father who didn't ask questions, and a debt that existed only because I believed it did. Looking back now, sitting in my truck in that parking lot with Marcus's question still ringing in my ears, I realized I couldn't remember a single moment in 11 years where Renee had ever specified what the money was actually for. Every time I'd start to ask, she'd shift the conversation, gently, almost lovingly, toward the kids, toward how much they missed their grandfather, toward how hard things still were. And every time, I let her. Because some part of me, the part that still heard that train whistle in my sleep some nights, didn't want an answer. It just wanted to keep paying. When I got home that evening, I did something I hadn't done in longer than I want to admit. I went looking for paperwork, real paperwork, the kind with numbers and signatures and dates, the kind that would tell me exactly what I'd been paying for all these years. I have a filing cabinet in the spare room, the same one I've had since before I retired from the railroad, and I sat down on the floor in front of it with my knees, complaining the whole way down, and started pulling folders. I found bank statements. Years of them going back further than I like to think about, each one showing the same withdrawal on the same schedule, same amount, same account number. But that's all I found. No letter from a lawyer, no settlement agreement, no itemized list of what the money was covering, funeral costs or medical bills or anything with Daniel's name attached to it in any official capacity. Just the plain fact of the payments themselves, over and over, like a habit that had worn a groove into my life so deep I'd stopped noticing it was there. I sat on that floor for a long time. I kept thinking there had to be something I was missing, some drawer I hadn't checked, some folder I'd misplaced. But the longer I looked, the more I had to admit to myself that there had never been anything to find. Renee had told me there was a debt, and I had believed her, and in 11 years, I had never once asked her to put it in writing. That's not the kind of thing you want to admit about yourself at 68 years old. It made me feel like a fool, and worse than that, it made me wonder what else I hadn't been asking questions about. I called her that night. I told myself I was just going to ask, plain and simple, for some paperwork, something I could look at, nothing accusatory, just a father wanting to understand what he'd been paying toward for over a decade. She picked up on the third ring, and I could hear the television on in the background, the kids' voices, somewhere in the house. When I asked her about it, there was a pause on the line, just a beat too long, before she said something about how complicated it all was, how it had been handled through people she trusted, how digging it all back up now would only stir up pain nobody needed. Then, almost in the same breath, she mentioned that Cole had a school thing coming up, that Emma had asked about me the other day, that maybe I should come by for dinner soon. It had been too long. I've thought about that phone call more times than I can count since then. At the time, I told myself she was just protecting the kids from more grief. That money talk after a death like that gets messy and painful for everyone involved. But there was something about the way she moved the conversation, so smooth, so practiced, from my questions straight into the grandchildren, that stuck with me longer than it should have. It was the kind of turn a person makes when they've made it 100 times before, not the kind a grieving widow makes by accident. I didn't push it that night. I told her dinner sounded good, and we hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hand, feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, which was suspicion. Not of Daniel's memory, not of anything about my son, but of the shape the last 11 years had taken because of a conversation I'd never questioned. I thought about calling her back and asking again, more directly this time. I thought about driving over there and just asking to see something, anything, in writing, but I didn't. I sat there instead, turning it all over, and somewhere in that turning, I thought of Diane. Diane was my late wife Carol's sister, the two of them close as sisters get, and Diane had spent almost 30 years working as a paralegal before she retired. She'd helped me with small things before, reading over paperwork when Carol passed, making sure I understood what I was signing. She was sharp in a way that made people underestimate her right, up until she caught something they'd missed. I hadn't talked to her much since Carol died. Not because of any falling out, just the way families sometimes drift when the person holding them together is gone. But sitting there that night, I knew if there was anybody who could help me make sense of 11 years of quiet payments and a debt I'd never seen on paper, it was her. I picked up the phone again, and this time I didn't call Renee. I called Diane, and I asked her if she had some time to sit down with me, because I had something I needed help understanding, and I didn't know who else to ask. Diane came by 2 days later, on a Friday morning, carrying a thermos of coffee and the same steady, no-nonsense look she'd always had, even back when she used to help Carol get through the paperwork after a bad diagnosis or a broken lease. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where Renee had once told me about obligations, and she set a legal pad in front of her before I'd even finished pouring the coffee. That was Diane. She believed in writing things down before feelings got in the way of facts. I told her everything, start to finish, the way I hadn't told anybody in 11 years. I told her about the conversation at that same table, about the vague word obligations, about the payments every second Wednesday, about Marcus at the bank, and the question that had cracked something open in me that I hadn't known was sealed shut. Diane listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of comfort, and when I finished, she sat quiet for a moment, tapping her pen against the edge of the pad. She asked me the same question Marcus had asked, just in a different shape. Did I ever see anything in writing? A settlement, a legal notice, an invoice, anything with a letterhead or a case number? I told her no, nothing. Just Renee's word and my own guilt filling in the rest. Diane didn't say what she was thinking right away, but I could see it moving behind her eyes, the same careful, methodical look she used to get when Carol's medical bills didn't add up right. She told me that in her 30 years doing legal work, she'd never once seen a real settlement or family debt handled the way I was describing. No documentation, no attorney, no formal account, just a verbal request and a standing wire transfer that never changed. I remember feeling something crack a little further in my chest when she said that, because some part of me had been hoping she'd tell me I was overreacting, that families handle things informally sometimes, that 11 years of trust wasn't something to throw suspicion on over one question from a 25-year-old bank teller. But Diane wasn't in the business of telling people what they wanted to hear. She asked me if I still had the account number I'd been sending money to. And I did. I'd had it memorized so long it felt like part of me. She wrote it down, along with the name of the bank and the approximate dates the payments had started. And she said, something that stuck with me the rest of that day and a lot of days after. She said that before we went any further asking questions about Renee, there was something more important I needed to do first, likes of my. And that was read the actual accident report from the night Daniel died. I told her I didn't need to read it, that I already knew what happened, that I'd lived with it every day for 11 years. Libby. Diane looked at me with the kind of patience she must have learned dealing with grieving families for 3 decades, and she said gently but firm that knowing what happened and knowing what the report actually said might not be the same thing at all. I didn't have a good answer for that. I realized sitting there that I had never actually read it. In the weeks after Daniel died, people had told me things, half sentences, gentle explanations, meant to spare a grieving father the technical details. I had built my guilt out of those half sentences and never once gone looking for the whole picture, because some part of me had been afraid of what I might find, or maybe more afraid of what I might not find. Some piece of blame with my name on it that I'd been waiting 11 years to confirm. Deanne told me she still had contacts from her old firm, people who could help pull public records, old case files, anything filed with the county or the rail authority after the accident. She said it might take a week, maybe 2, but she'd get her hands on it. Before she left that morning, she put her hand over mine on the table, the same way Carol used to when she was trying to steady me through something hard. And she told me that whatever we found, good or bad, I deserved to actually know it instead of carrying around a version of the truth I'd never even confirmed. I sat at that table long after her car pulled out of the driveway, staring at the blank space on the legal pad, where she'd start writing the real story. And for the first time in 11 years, I let myself admit that I was afraid of what that story might turn out to be. A week Diane asked for turned into 10 days, and every one of them felt longer than the last. I went to work at the hardware store like normal, stocked shelves, rang people up, made small talk about weather and lawnmowers, lied. And underneath all of it, I kept waiting for my phone to ring. I didn't say anything to Renee during that stretch. I saw her once at a birthday party for Cole that I almost didn't go to, and I watched her laugh with the other parents and cut the cake and hand out plates. I kept searching her face for something I couldn't name, some crack in the smoothness of it all. I didn't find one. If anything, she seemed lighter than I'd seen her in years, and that observation sat uneasy in my stomach the whole drive home. Diane called on a Tuesday evening. I remember exactly where I was standing, at the kitchen counter, with a dish towel still in my hand, when my phone buzzed and her name came up on the screen. She asked if she could come by, tonight if possible, and something in her voice told me this wasn't a call where she wanted to talk over the phone. She showed up 40 minutes later with a folder thick enough that it needed a rubber band around it. And she set it down on the kitchen table like it weighed more than paper should. She started with the accident report itself, the real one, filed by the county and cross-referenced with the rail authority's own investigation. I sat there with my hands flat on the table, bracing myself the way you do before a doctor gives you news you've been dreading. Diane read through the summary slowly, and the words took a moment to land, because they weren't the words I'd built my guilt around for 11 years. The report stated plainly the crossing gate at that intersection had failed to lower in time due to a mechanical defect in the gate arm motor, a defect that was later traced to a batch of faulty components installed by the manufacturer 2 years before the accident. There was nothing in that report about the signal crew, nothing about human error on the night shift, nothing about me. I asked her to read it again, because I wasn't sure I'd heard it right the first time. She did, patient as ever. The second time through it didn't sound any different. The gate had failed because of a manufactured part, installed by a company that had no idea I existed, on a piece of equipment I had never touched and had no authority over. Diane pulled another page from the folder, a federal recall notice issued 8 months after Daniel's death for the exact same gate arm motor model, citing multiple failures across different rail lines in 3 states. 8 months. I sat with that for a long moment, the recall notice, sitting there on my kitchen table, like something that had been waiting 11 years for me to finally look at it. I want to tell you, I felt relief in that moment, and maybe somewhere underneath everything else, I did. But mostly what I felt was a kind of grief I hadn't expected. A grief for the 11 years I'd spent punishing myself for something that was never mine to carry. I thought about every Wednesday drive to that bank, every silent apology I'd whispered to Daniel in my head while I filled out that withdrawal slip, every time I'd told myself I deserved to feel exactly as heavy as I did. All of it had been built on a story I'd never checked, a story that wasn't even true. Diane let me sit with it for a while before she said anything else. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, the way it gets when she's about to say something she knows is going to hurt. She told me that if I wasn't responsible for what happened that night, then there was a harder question underneath the one we'd already answered, and that question was why Renee had let me believe otherwise for 11 years, and what exactly all that money had actually been paying for, if not what she'd always told me it was. Life, I didn't have an answer for that. I sat there staring at the recall notice, at the gate arm motor number, circled in Diane's careful handwriting, and I realized that the story I thought I understood, the story that had shaped every Wednesday of my life for over a decade, wasn't even the beginning of the real one. Somewhere out there was another version of events, one that involved my son's widow and 11 years of silence, and I didn't know yet whether I had the strength to go looking for it. But I knew, sitting at that table with Diane's steady hand resting near mine, that I couldn't go back to not knowing, not anymore. I didn't sleep much that night, and by morning I knew there was only one person I needed to talk to before I said another word to Renee, and that was my son Thomas. Thomas was younger than Daniel by 3 years, quieter, the kind of boy who'd always stood a little to the side of his brother growing up. Not because there was any bad blood between them, just because that's how some brothers settle into a family, one out front and one a step behind. After Daniel died, Thomas had married Renee's closest friend from high school, a woman named Karen, and the two of them lived about 20 minutes from me, close enough that I should have seen more of him than I did. I drove over that Wednesday morning, skipping my shift at the hardware store for the first time in longer than I could remember, and I found Thomas in his garage, same as always, tinkering with something on his workbench that didn't really need fixing. He does that when he's thinking, keeps his hands busy so his mind has somewhere quiet to work. I told him I needed to talk, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I meant it to, because he set down whatever he was holding and gave me his full attention right away. I told him everything Diane had found, the accident report, the recall notice, the gate arm motor that had nothing to do with me or the signal crew. I watched his face while I talked, and I want to tell you I expected shock, maybe even relief on my behalf, the kind of reaction a son gives a father who's just been cleared of a guilt he never should have carried. But that's not what I saw. What I saw was something closer to fear, a stillness that didn't match the news I was delivering, and it stopped me mid-sentence. I asked him straight out if he already knew. There was a long pause, long enough that I had my answer before he ever opened his mouth. He told me he'd known for almost 3 years. He said it quiet, almost like a confession dragged out of him, and then the rest came slower, like each piece cost him something to say. He told me that a few years back, he'd been helping Renee sort through some old paperwork for a refinance on her house, and he'd noticed the numbers didn't add up the way she'd always described them to family. Payments coming in that didn't match any legal settlement, no case number, no attorney of record, nothing but a standing transfer from an account he recognized immediately. Because it was mine, I asked him why he never said anything, why he let me keep driving to that bank every second Wednesday for 3 more years, believing I owed a debt that didn't exist. His hands were shaking a little by then, and he told me it wasn't that simple, that Renee was still his brother's widow, still Karen's oldest friend, still the mother raising his niece and nephew, and that every time he thought about confronting her, he pictured the whole family coming apart at the seams, Karen caught in the middle, Emma and Cole losing whatever stability they had left after already losing their father. He said he told himself he was protecting people, He said the longer it went on, the harder it got to imagine any version of bringing it up that didn't end in disaster. Then he walked to the back corner of the garage behind a stack of old paint cans and pulled out a shoebox I hadn't noticed until that moment. He set it on the workbench and lifted the lid, and inside was a stack of papers he'd been quietly gathering for 3 years. Copies of bank statements, notes he'd made, comparing dates and amounts, a printout of Renee's old refinance application with numbers circled in the same careful way Diane had circled that recall notice. He told me he hadn't known what to do with any of it. He'd built this whole case against his brother's widow and then just let it sit in a shoebox behind paint cans because he couldn't stomach the thought of what using it might do to everyone left standing. I sat down on an old stool near his workbench because my legs didn't feel steady enough to hold me standing anymore. Here was my surviving son, carrying his own version of the same weight I'd been carrying, 3 years of silence instead of my 11, but silence all the same, both of us protecting people who maybe didn't need protecting nearly as much as we needed to finally know the truth. I asked him if he had any idea why Renee had actually needed the money, if not for the reason she'd always given us. Thomas looked at that shoebox for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, his voice dropped lower, like he was finally letting go of something he'd been holding on to with both hands for 3 long years. Thomas told me it started with the house. Renee and Daniel had bought it 2 years before he died, stretched themselves thin to do it the way young couples sometimes do, betting on 2 incomes and a future that seemed steady enough at the time. When Daniel died, that future collapsed overnight. Renee was left with a mortgage built for 2 salaries, a newborn on the way, a toddler who still needed watching every hour of the day, life insurance policy through Daniel's job that turned out to be smaller than anybody expected. Barely enough to cover the funeral and a few months of bills. Thomas said he'd pieced most of this together slowly, 1 document at a time, over those 3 years. Renee had fallen behind on the mortgage within the first few months after the funeral, quietly, without telling anyone, because she didn't want the family to see her drowning on top of everything else. She'd taken out a small loan to catch up, then a second one, when the first wasn't enough, and somewhere in that scramble, 6 weeks after burying her husband, she'd sat down across from me at my kitchen table and found the one source of money that never asked a single question: me. I asked Thomas if he thought she'd planned it, sat down that day already intending to deceive me. He shook his head slowly and said he didn't believe that, not really. He said, from what he could tell, piecing together dates and numbers looked more like something that started small and honest, maybe even something she believed a little herself in that first terrible year. Grief and financial panic tangled together so tight she couldn't have pulled them apart if she'd tried. But somewhere along the way, what started as a desperate woman accepting help from a grieving father became something else, a pattern she leaned on longer than she needed to, long after the mortgage was caught up and the loans were paid off and the money had stopped being about survival and started being about comfort. New furniture, a better car, summer camp for the kids that Thomas said always struck him as a little too nice for what Renee's actual income could support. I sat with that for a long time, turning it over, feeling something complicated settle into my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite forgiveness either. I thought about Renee at that kitchen table 11 years ago, thin and hollow-eyed, carrying my son's unborn child, and some part of me still ached for that woman, still understood how a person drowning in grief and terror might reach for whatever kept her head above water without stopping to ask if it was right. But I also thought about every Wednesday since, every silent apology I'd made to Daniel while I filled out that withdrawal slip. Every year I'd let that guilt calcify into something that shaped how I saw myself, and I couldn't make those 2 feelings sit easy together. I asked Thomas what he thought I should do. He was quiet for a while, turning a wrench over in his hands without really looking at it, and then he told me he didn't think this was about punishing Renee, not really. Not if I was being honest with myself. He said the accident report had already answered the biggest question, the one that mattered most, that I hadn't caused Daniel's death and never had. What was left now wasn't really about revenge. It was about the truth finally being spoken out loud in front of everyone it touched, so that nobody had to keep carrying secrets that weren't theirs to carry anymore. He said, if we came at Renee, swinging, accusing, threatening, we'd lose any chance of keeping this family together. Emma and Cole would be the ones who paid for it. I told him I needed to think, and he told me to take whatever time I needed. But not too long, because he'd been sitting on this for 3 years, and some part of him had started to feel like the shoebox behind the paint cans was its own kind of lie. Before I left the garage that day, he asked me one more thing, quiet, almost afraid of the answer. He asked if I was angry with him for staying silent so long. I told him the truth, which was that I understood exactly why he had, better than almost anyone could, because I'd spent 11 years staying silent about my own guilt, for reasons that felt just as impossible to explain from the inside. We stood there for a minute, two men who'd both been carrying something alone that should have been carried together, and then I told him it was time. Time to sit down with Renee together and finally lay everything out on the table, evidence and all, and see what was left of this family once the truth was finally out in the open. We set it up for a Sunday evening after the kids were down for the night, so Emma and Cole wouldn't be anywhere near what was about to happen. Thomas called Renee and asked if we could all sit down together. No explanation beyond needing to talk about some family matters, and I could tell by the careful way he chose his words that some part of her already sensed this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. We met at Thomas and Karen's place at their kitchen table with Diane's folder and Thomas's shoebox, both sitting between us like something none of us wanted to look at directly. Renee showed up a few minutes late, still in her work clothes, and I watched her eyes move across the table, across the folder, across the shoebox, across the careful, guarded way Thomas and I were both sitting. And I saw something shift in her face before anyone had said a single word. She sat down slowly, and I started because I didn't know how else to do it except plainly. I told her about the accident report. I told her about the recall notice, about the gate arm motor, about 11 years of guilt built on something that had never been true. I watched her go pale, and for a moment I thought maybe that alone would be enough. But she'd simply confirm what Thomas and I already suspected, and we could move straight into figuring out how to fix it together. But that's not what happened. Instead, her face hardened into something defensive, and she said she didn't understand what any of that had to do with the money, that the accident report was about the crossing gate, not about what the family had needed afterward. I told her as gently as I could manage with my hands shaking under the table that there was never any documentation for what I'd been paying, no settlement, no legal claim, nothing but her word, repeated for 11 years. That's when Thomas slid the shoebox across the table and opened it. And I watched something in Renee break open at the sight of it. Like she understood immediately that whatever careful story she'd been telling herself for 11 years had just run out of road. She denied it first, quick and sharp, said Thomas didn't understand what he was looking at, that he'd misread old paperwork out of context. But Thomas, calmer than I expected, calmer than I think even he expected, laid out the dates one by one, the mortgage default, the loans, the timing of when the payments to me had started, and how closely they lined up with her own financial collapse. Renee's denial cracked somewhere in the middle of that, and what came out from underneath it wasn't calm at all. She stood up from the table, voice rising, and said none of us understood what it had been like, alone with a toddler and a baby on the way, watching everything she and Daniel had built together crumble in real time, while everyone around her grieved him like she wasn't drowning right alongside that grief herself. She said she'd done what she had to do to survive, and that neither of us had any right to sit there now, years later, safe and comfortable, judging the choices she'd made in her worst moment. I heard footsteps upstairs, quick and small. I realized with a jolt that Cole must have woken up and was standing somewhere near the top of the stairs, listening to more of this than any 9-year-old should ever hear. Karen went up immediately to check on him. The room went quiet in a way that felt worse than the shouting had. Renee sat back down slowly, her hands pressed flat against her face for a moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had dropped to almost nothing. She admitted it. She admitted there'd never been a real settlement, never a debt in any legal sense, just a fabrication that started as survival and became something she didn't know how to stop once it had gone on long enough to feel normal. But she said it with a kind of desperate defiance, too, insisting she'd had no choice, that I would have said no if she'd ever asked outright for help without dressing it up as an obligation tied to Daniel's death. I didn't answer that right away, because honestly, I wasn't sure it was true, and I wasn't sure it wasn't either. I sat there with 11 years of guilt and grief and love all tangled together, looking at a woman who was both my son's widow and the person who had let me believe a lie for over a decade. I felt the whole room tilting towards something I couldn't control anymore. Renee said if we were going to treat her like a criminal over this, she didn't see how any of us could keep being family, and that maybe it was better if she just took the kids and we all found some distance for a while. Thomas told her that wasn't what anyone wanted, but she was already standing, already reaching for her coat. I sat there at that table watching 11 years of quiet payments explode into something that felt for one terrible moment like it might cost me my grandchildren instead of finally giving me peace. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running the whole conversation over and over. Renee's voice cracking, Cole's small footsteps on the stairs, the sound of her car pulling out of Thomas's driveway faster than it should have. By morning, I understood something I hadn't let myself see clearly the night before, which was that if I let this end the way it had ended at that kitchen table, in anger and accusation and a mother threatening to take her children and disappear, then whatever justice I found would cost me more than 11 years of misplaced guilt ever had. It would cost me Emma and Cole, and that wasn't a price I was willing to let this family pay, not after everything else it had already lost. I called Diane first thing that morning, and I asked her a different kind of question than the ones I'd been asking her for weeks. I didn't ask her to help me prove Renee wrong anymore. I asked her to help me figure out what making this right could actually look like in a way that didn't tear apart the only grandchildren I had left. Diane, true to form, didn't waste time being surprised by the shift. She told me that from a practical standpoint, there were ways to formalize what had happened that didn't require punishment for its own sake. Ways to convert 11 years of quiet, undocumented payments into something honest, something with Renee's name on it, instead of hidden behind my guilt. Boast of mine. Over the next several days, Diane and I worked out a plan, and I brought Thomas in on it too, because I wasn't interested in deciding Renee's future without my surviving son sitting right beside me the way he should have been from the start. The plan was simple in the end, simpler than 11 years of silence probably deserved. Renee would formally acknowledge what had happened in writing to protect all of us going forward. Any future financial support I chose to give, and I decided there would be some, because I still loved those children and their well-being mattered more to me than being right, would happen openly in her name, structured as an actual agreement instead of a debt built on a lie. No more vague obligations. No more silent Wednesdays carrying weight that was never mine. Thomas was the one who reached out to her first, a few days after that terrible Sunday night, and asked if she'd be willing to sit down again, just the two of them this time, without Diane's folder or Thomas's shoebox laid out like evidence in a trial. I don't know everything that was said in that conversation because some of it wasn't mine to know, but Thomas told me afterward that Renee had cried for a long time, not the sharp, defensive tears from that night at the kitchen table, but something quieter, something that sounded more like relief than anger. She told him she'd known for years the story couldn't hold forever, that some part of her had been waiting for it to collapse, almost hoping for it, because carrying the lie had gotten heavier than she ever let anyone see. She agreed to meet with Diane and me the following week, and that conversation went nothing like the one before it. There was no shouting, no threats to disappear with the children. Renee sat across from me at my own kitchen table this time, the same table where this had all started 11 years earlier, and she signed the papers Diane had prepared, acknowledging what had happened and agreeing to the new arrangement going forward. She apologized to me directly, plainly, without the defensiveness from before, and told me she was sorry for letting me carry guilt that was never mine, sorry for how long she'd let it go on, sorry that fear had made her choices for her instead of honesty. I told her I understood more about fear and guilt-shaping choices than she probably realized, given how I'd spent the last decade of my own life, and something in that admission seemed to ease something between us that I don't think either of us expected. It wasn't a clean ending, and I don't want to make it sound like one. There was still an awkwardness between us that would take real time to soften, still a wariness in Renee's eyes some days when she looked at me. Still moments where I caught myself feeling the ghost of that old anger flicker back up before I reminded myself where we'd landed. But it was honest now, in a way it hadn't been in 11 years, and honest, even when it's uncomfortable, is a kind of peace all its own. Diane filed the paperwork properly, the way it always should have been done from the start, and for the first time since that Sunday afternoon 6 weeks after Daniel's funeral, I felt like the ground under this family had finally stopped shifting. The Sunday dinner happened 3 weeks later, the first one in longer than I wanted to count. where the whole family sat around the same table without anything unspoken hanging over it. Karen made a pot roast the way Carol used to make it, and Thomas sat at the head of the table like he'd finally grown into the space he'd spent years standing a little behind. Emma, who was 14 now and sharper than she probably even knew, kept looking over at me during dinner with a kind of careful curiosity, like she could sense something had shifted in the family, even if nobody had explained the details to her. Cole, younger and less guarded, just seemed happy to have his grandfather back at the table asking about his baseball season like it was the most important thing in the world. Which, that evening it was. After dinner, Emma followed me out to the porch while I was getting some air, and she sat down next to me without saying much at first. Eventually, she asked, careful the way teenagers get when they're testing whether a question is allowed, if everything was okay now between me and her mom. I told her the truth, that things were better than they'd been in a long time, that grown-ups sometimes carry things alone for too long before they finally figure out how to carry them together, and that her mother and I had finally done that. She nodded like that made sense to her, and then she leaned her head against my shoulder for a minute, the way she used to when she was small, and I felt something in my chest ease that had been tight for 11 years. The following Saturday, I drove out to the cemetery by myself, something I hadn't done in longer than I like to admit, because for years visiting Daniel's grave had felt less like remembering him and more like reporting for a punishment I thought I deserved. It was a clear morning, cool enough for a jacket, and I stood there for a long time before I said anything out loud. I told him about the accident report, about the gate arm motor and the recall notice, about how I'd spent 11 years believing I'd failed him that night, when the truth was I'd had no more control over that crossing gate than he did. I told him about Renee, about Thomas and the shoebox behind the paint cans, about how the whole family had finally laid everything out on a table and found a way through it instead of around it. And I told him I was sorry it took me this long to ask the questions I should have asked from the very beginning, but that I was asking them now, and that I wasn't going to carry guilt that wasn't mine any longer. Not for him, not for anyone. I still go to that bank sometimes, though it's different now. A few weeks after everything settled, I stopped in on an ordinary Wednesday. Not because I owed anyone anything anymore, but because I needed a new checkbook, plain and simple. Marcus was still there behind the counter, and he recognized me right away, and something in his face told me he remembered our conversation from all those months back, even though neither of us said anything about it directly. He asked how I was doing, the kind of question tellers ask everybody, but there was something more careful in the way he asked it, and I told him, honestly, that I was doing better than I had in a long time. He smiled and processed my request, and I walked back out to my truck without the weight I used to carry through those doors, without the tightness in my chest that used to build every second Wednesday like clockwork. These days, Sunday dinners happen more often than they used to, and I've started teaching Cole how to fix small things around the house, the way I once tried to teach Daniel, the way nobody ever got the chance to teach Thomas, because I was too buried in my own grief back then to notice he needed it too. Emma asks me questions sometimes about her father, real questions, the kind that deserve real answers, and I give them to her now instead of deflecting the way I used to, when the guilt made even his memory feel too heavy to touch honestly. Renee and I aren't where we started, and we're not pretending we ever will be, but there's an honesty between us, now that feels sturdier than the silence ever did. I think about that Wednesday at the bank sometimes, the one where a young teller I'd never met before asked me a question nobody had thought to ask in 11 years. I think about how one honest question, asked plainly by a stranger who didn't know any better than to ask it, was enough to finally set a whole family free.